Unless that old man can whisper to turbines, this bird isn't flying today. Captain Ryan Mercer's voice carried across the tarmac with an easy arrogance, sharp as the late afternoon sun beating down on Fort Redding's flight line, and a few of the younger crew chiefs laughed as the H-64 Apache sat motionless in front of them, its long rotor blades stretched out against a pale Texas sky, perfectly still, perfectly silent, like a predator that had forgotten how to breathe. The heat shimmered off the concrete in wavering sheets, distorting the aircraft's shadow, and the faint smell of aviation fuel mixed with hot metal hung in the air, while laptops balanced on rolling carts flashed green diagnostic lines that insisted everything was fine, everything nominal, everything ready. And yet when Mercer had hit the starter 10 minutes earlier, the engine had coughed once and gone quiet, leaving only an embarrassing silence where the deep, rhythmic thump of rotor wash should have been. Standing a few yards back, hands tucked loosely into the pockets of a faded brown jacket, Ethan Caldwell didn't laugh. He didn't move much at all. 72 years old, shoulders slightly rounded, hair the color of dry winter grass. He looked like he belonged anywhere but here, and that was precisely why Mercer had noticed him. "Sir, this is a restricted maintenance zone," Mercer called out, walking toward him with confident strides, flight suit crisp, captain's bars catching the light. "We're troubleshooting a $35 million aircraft. Spectators aren't part of the checklist." Ethan's eyes, pale and steady, drifted from Mercer's face back to the Apache's engine housing, as if the machine were speaking in a language only he could hear. The aircraft's skin ticked softly as it cooled under the sun, a faint metallic settling that most of the younger techs ignored. Mercer followed his gaze and smirked. "What, you think you see something we missed?" Around them, wrenches clinked against toolboxes, and Specialist Daniel Brooks shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the old man and the dead helicopter. The diagnostics had been run twice. Fuel pressure good. Electrical system stable. No fault codes. On paper, the Apache should have been airborne already, slicing through the sky at 150 knots. Instead, it sat grounded, stubborn and unmoved. Ethan stepped closer, slow but deliberate, stopping just outside the painted safety line. He tilted his head slightly, listening, not to the men, but to the machine. "She's not dead," he said quietly, voice low and even. "She's holding her breath." A couple of crew members exchanged amused looks. Mercer let out a short laugh. "With all due respect, sir, this isn't 1972. We don't diagnose helicopters by feeling the vibes in the air." The words hung there, light and careless, and Ethan didn't answer right away. His gaze traced the contour of the exhaust housing, the subtle angle of a panel most people walked past without a second thought. The wind picked up just enough to nudge the rotor blades, and they shifted a fraction of an inch, a soft creak of composite against metal. Mercer folded his arms. "Tell you what," he said, tone edged with challenge. "If you think you can start her, be my guest." He gestured theatrically toward the Apache. "Go ahead. Show us." The laughter was quieter this time, uncertain. Ethan studied the aircraft for another long second, then took a step forward toward the side access panel beneath the engine cowling, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had stood beside machines like this long before digital screens told men what to think. The Apache didn't look different to anyone else. But to Ethan Caldwell, it was remembering something the computers could not see. Ethan Caldwell did not rush the way younger men did when they wanted to prove something. He reached the access panel beneath the engine cowling and rested his palm against the metal for a brief moment, as if confirming a memory rather than searching for a fault. The surface was warm from the sun, but beneath that warmth he could feel a faint, irregular vibration, subtle and uneven, like a skipped heartbeat. Captain Ryan Mercer watched with folded arms and an expression that hovered between amusement and impatience. Around them, the maintenance crew slowed their movements, tools pausing midair, conversations fading into the background hum of generators and distant taxiing aircraft. Specialist Daniel Brooks stepped closer, curiosity overcoming hesitation. Ethan crouched carefully, knees stiff but steady, and traced a finger along the seam of the panel. "You ran the auxiliary power unit twice," he said calmly, not looking up. Mercer gave a short nod. "3 times. Fuel flow is clean. Electrical output is stable." There is no mechanical fault. Ethan nodded slightly. The computer sees clean numbers. That does not mean. The engine is breathing right. A faint smile tugged at Mercer's mouth. With respect, sir, engines do not breathe. Ethan lifted his gaze then, and for a split second there was something in his eyes that made Brooks straighten. Every turbine breathes, he replied softly. Air in. Combustion. Air out. If the rhythm is off, she chokes. He unlatched the panel and eased it open, revealing a compact network of linkages and housings that most of the younger crew only referenced through diagrams on a screen. The smell of warm oil drifted upward. Ethan leaned closer, listening again, not to a sound anyone else could distinguish, but to a pattern. The breeze nudged the rotor blades overhead, and they shifted slightly, casting slow-moving shadows across the concrete. For a moment, the present dissolved for him. The shimmer of heat over Texas tarmac blurred into a memory of thick jungle humidity decades earlier, rotor blades hanging still against a gray sky, a young pilot waiting, eyes steady despite the pressure of time. The machine had refused to respond then, too. The fix had not been in a manual. It had been in the way the governor linkage settled when heat expanded the housing by less than a quarter inch. Ethan's hand moved now with quiet certainty. He touched a slender control rod tucked just behind the visible assembly. It was seated, but not aligned true. Off by barely a fraction. 2 millimeters at most. Too small for a warning light. Large enough to disrupt the rhythm. There, he murmured. Mercer stepped forward, frown deepening. We inspected that. You inspected it cold, Ethan answered. She shifts when she warms. Brooks felt a chill despite the heat. The old man did not speak like someone guessing. He spoke like someone remembering. Ethan adjusted the linkage with careful pressure, not forcing it, simply guiding it back into alignment. He closed the panel without drama and rose slowly to his feet. Try her now, he said. Mercer hesitated, pride wrestling with practicality. Then he signaled to the cockpit. The starter engaged with a sharp whine. For one suspended second nothing changed. Then the engine caught, low and steady. A deep vibration rolled through the airframe. Overhead, the rotor blades trembled, then began to turn, slow at first, then gathering speed, cutting through the hot Texas air with a building, unmistakable rhythm that no computer screen could replicate. The Apache was breathing again. The sound built slowly, not explosive, not dramatic, but steady and undeniable, a deep mechanical rhythm rolling across the flight line as the rotor blades gathered speed and carved wide arcs through the bright Texas sky, pushing hot air downward in heavy waves that rippled across the concrete and flattened loose papers against tool carts. Specialist Daniel Brooks felt the vibration in his chest before he fully registered what he was seeing. The Apache was not coughing anymore. It was alive. Captain Ryan Mercer stood frozen beside the aircraft, headset in one hand, eyes locked on the spinning blades as if the laws of physics had shifted without his permission. The diagnostic tablet at his side still displayed clean green lines, but now the machine itself was speaking louder than any screen. Ethan Caldwell did not celebrate. He stepped back from the aircraft, hands resting loosely at his sides, watching the rotor speed increase with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had not doubted the outcome. The engine tone smoothed out, losing its earlier hesitation, settling into a confident hum that resonated through the fuselage. Crew members who had laughed minutes earlier were no longer smiling. One of them instinctively removed his cap. The downwash lifted dust in a wide circle around the landing gear, and Mercer finally moved, climbing into the cockpit with a stiffness that had nothing to do with procedure. He ran through the startup checklist again, slower this time, verifying readings that now aligned perfectly. Torque steady, temperatures normal, no warning lights, no hesitation, just smooth, responsive power. Brooks glanced at Ethan, studying the old man's profile against the spinning blur of blades. There was no pride in his expression, no triumph, only recognition. The helicopter had not surprised him. It had confirmed him. The rumble grew fuller as Mercer advanced the throttle slightly, and the Apache responded without resistance. The aircraft that had refused to breathe an hour earlier now answered every command. A black government sport utility vehicle rolled onto the edge of the flight line, tires crunching over loose gravel. Few noticed it at first. The rotor wash drowned out softer sounds. But Brooks saw the vehicle door open and straightened instinctively. Colonel James Whitaker stepped out in full-service uniform despite the heat, jacket buttoned, posture rigid. He did not rush. He walked, with deliberate purpose toward the aircraft, eyes fixed not on the captain in the cockpit, but on the man standing calmly beside the landing skid. Mercer completed the final check and eased the throttle back to idle, bringing the rotor's speed down gradually until the blades slowed from a blur to visible arcs. The hum softened but did not disappear. Whitaker stopped a few feet from Ethan. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The air still trembled with residual vibration. Mercer climbed down from the cockpit, boots hitting the concrete harder than necessary. He opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to defend, but Colonel Whitaker raised one hand slightly, not in anger, but in restraint. His gaze remained on Ethan Caldwell, and something in his expression shifted from command to memory. The flight line was silent except for the fading spin of composite blades above them. Colonel James Whitaker stopped 3 feet from Ethan Caldwell, close enough to see the fine tremor in the old man's hands, close enough to hear the last slow rotations of the Apache's blades cutting through the air above them. And for a moment the busy flight line seemed to contract around that small circle of concrete where rank, age, and memory stood facing one another. Captain Ryan Mercer straightened instinctively, boots together, chin lifted, but Whitaker did not look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan, studying his face as if confirming something long carried in quiet certainty. The rotor finally slowed to a near stop, blades settling into stillness, and the sudden absence of motion made the silence heavier. Whitaker's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. "Ethan Caldwell," he said, voice steady, carrying without effort across the line. It was not a question. It was a statement shaped by years. A faint shift passed through the maintenance crew. Brooks felt it first, the change in tone, the weight behind the name. Ethan met the colonel's gaze without flinching. "Good to see you upright, James," he replied softly. The use of the first name landed harder than any reprimand. Mercer's eyes flicked between them, confusion overtaking confidence. Whitaker inhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes before stepping into something that matters. "You adjusted the governor linkage," he said. 2 millimeters off. Ethan gave the slightest nod. "Heat expansion," he answered. "She was never starving. She just needed alignment." Whitaker glanced at the Apache, then back at the old man, and something in his posture shifted from command to respect. Without announcement, without spectacle, he brought his right hand up in a precise, deliberate salute. It was sharp. It was unhesitating. The movement cut cleanly through the still air. Every crew member on that line saw it. Brooks felt his spine straighten before he realized he was mirroring the posture. Mercer froze completely, the earlier smirk erased by a dawning understanding he had not anticipated. Ethan did not return the salute immediately. He studied Whitaker for a long second, as if measuring not the rank on his shoulders but the years behind his eyes. Then, slowly, he lifted his own hand. The salute was not crisp in the military sense. Age had softened the edges, but it was steady. It was intentional, and it carried a history no uniform could fully display. Whitaker lowered his hand first. "You kept my aircraft in the air more than once," he said quietly, not for the audience, but for the truth of it. "I learned early that if you were calm, we were safe." The words were simple. They did not dramatize. They did not explain. Yet the effect was unmistakable. Mercer's shoulders dropped a fraction. The narrative he had built about an outdated civilian dissolved under the weight of a single sentence. Ethan looked past Whitaker to the Apache resting behind him. "She is a good machine," he said. "Just needed someone to listen." Whitaker nodded once. Around them, the crew stood silent, the lesson settling deeper than any technical briefing could have delivered. The aircraft had spun because a forgotten hand remembered how it felt when steel was trusted more than screens. And in that quiet, on a stretch of sunlit concrete measured in feet and years, respect shifted without a single raised voice. The silence did not break immediately after the salute. It settled over the flight line like a held breath, heavy and clarifying, and even the distant rumble of other aircraft seemed muted, as if the base itself understood something had just shifted. Colonel James Whitaker let his hand fall to his side and studied Ethan Caldwell with a look that carried decades inside it. Captain Ryan Mercer stood rigid, heat pressing against his flight suit, the earlier confidence draining from his posture in quiet degrees. Specialist Daniel Brooks glanced at Mercer, then back at the old man, seeing now what he had missed before. Not age, not fragility, experience. Whitaker finally turned toward Mercer, but his voice remained calm, controlled. Captain, when you troubleshoot a machine like this, you use every tool available. That includes the people who built the foundation you stand on. There was no anger in the statement, no raised tone, and that made it land harder. Mercer swallowed and nodded once. Yes, sir. The words were tight, but sincere. He stepped toward Ethan, removing his glove slowly, as if shedding something unnecessary. Sir, he began, then paused, choosing the right approach for the first time that afternoon. I should not have dismissed you. Ethan regarded him steadily. The rotor blades above were fully still now, casting long shadows across the concrete as the sun dipped lower in the sky. You trusted the screen, Ethan said quietly. That is not wrong. But machines do not only speak in numbers. Mercer gave a faint, almost self-conscious nod. I see that now. Brooks felt the weight of the exchange settle deeper than any classroom lesson. This was not about a linkage or a startup sequence. It was about something older, something quieter. Whitaker stepped back slightly, giving the two men space. Ethan, he said, voice softening. You never asked for recognition. Ethan's lips curved just enough to suggest a restrained smile. Recognition does not keep rotors turning, he replied. A faint breeze stirred across the tarmac, cooler now, carrying the scent of fuel and sun-baked asphalt. The Apache rested behind them, solid and dependable, as if unaware it had just become the center of a lesson no manual could teach. Mercer looked at the aircraft, then back at Ethan. Would you walk me through it? He asked. There was no challenge left in his tone, only respect. Ethan studied him for a moment, measuring not rank, but willingness. Then he nodded. Start with listening, he said. They moved together toward the open panel, Mercer leaning in not as a skeptic, but as a student. Brooks followed, absorbing every word as Ethan explained how heat shifts tolerances, how small misalignments compound under load, how patience reveals what urgency hides. Across the flight line, no speeches followed, no ceremony, just a captain learning from a veteran, and a helicopter that had reminded everyone present that experience is not outdated simply because it is older. Steel remembers steady hands. And respect, once recognized, does not fade with time. The sun dipped lower over Fort Redding, turning the wide Texas sky a muted gold that reflected softly off the Apache's canopy, and the flight line gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but the energy had shifted in a way no checklist could measure. Captain Ryan Mercer stood beside Ethan Caldwell at the open panel, listening as the older man traced the path of airflow with a steady finger, explaining how tolerances tighten when heat builds, how metal expands in fractions of an inch that software can calculate, but not always interpret in context. Specialist Daniel Brooks absorbed every word, committing it to memory with a focus that felt different from routine training. This was not theory. This was lived knowledge distilled into calm instruction. Colonel James Whitaker remained a few steps back, hands clasped behind him, watching the exchange with quiet approval. He saw the subtle change in Mercer's posture, the way the captain no longer leaned back with crossed arms, but leaned in, asking measured questions, nodding as he processed answers. You cannot rush understanding, Ethan said evenly. Machines reward patience. They punish assumption. Mercer glanced toward the cockpit, then back at the exposed linkage. I relied on the diagnostics, he admitted. I trusted the numbers. Ethan's gaze softened slightly. Numbers are tools. They are not instincts. You have to learn both. The breeze carried a cooler edge now, brushing across the concrete and stirring loose grit along the painted safety lines. In the distance, another helicopter lifted off, its rotor wash rippling the air in steady pulses. Brooks looked at Ethan with newfound clarity. The old jacket, the weathered boots, the quiet demeanor had hidden something that no uniform could replicate. Experience did not announce itself. It revealed itself when tested. Whitaker finally stepped forward, voice low but firm. Captain Mercer, he said, remember this day. Not because the aircraft started. Because you listened. Mercer met his gaze without defensiveness. Yes, sir. There was no sarcasm left in him. Only humility, settling into place like a properly aligned part. Ethan closed the panel carefully, securing the latch with practiced ease. The Apache stood ready now, no longer a silent challenge, but a functioning partner in the sky. He wiped his hands on a clean cloth Brooks offered and handed it back with a small nod of thanks. "She will serve you well," he said to Mercer. "Just respect her language." Mercer extended his hand, not out of obligation, but genuine acknowledgement. Ethan took it. The handshake was firm, steady, unspoken understanding passing between generations. Whitaker looked from one to the other and allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "Steele remembers steady hands," he said quietly. The statement lingered in the warm evening air. Around them, the base resumed its steady cadence of motion and sound, but something foundational had been reinforced without ceremony or spectacle. A captain had gained perspective. A crew had witnessed silent mastery. And an aircraft had reminded them all that experience is not obsolete simply because it is older. Respect is not programmed into a system. It is recognized when the blades begin to turn. The evening settled gently over Fort Reading, the last light of day stretching long shadows across the flight line as technicians secured equipment and the steady rhythm of base operations resumed its familiar cadence. Ethan Caldwell stood a few yards from the Apache, hands resting lightly at his sides, watching as Captain Ryan Mercer conducted a final walk-around inspection with slower, more deliberate steps than earlier that afternoon. There was no trace of impatience now. Every panel seam, every fastener, every intake curve received a measured glance. Specialist Daniel Brooks followed close behind the captain, absorbing the change in tempo as much as the technical process itself. Colonel James Whitaker remained near the edge of the tarmac, jacket collar catching the warm breeze, observing without interruption. Mercer paused near the engine housing and ran his hand lightly along the metal, not to adjust anything, but to feel the surface the way Ethan had done. He glanced back toward the older man. "You said she shifts when she warms," Mercer called out, voice respectful but steady. Ethan nodded once. "Metal remembers pressure," he replied. "It settles where it is treated consistently." The statement hung in the air with a meaning that extended beyond machinery. Brooks sensed it immediately. This was no longer just a lesson in maintenance. It was a lesson in leadership. Mercer climbed into the cockpit once more. Movements precise, but no longer hurried. He signaled for a brief systems check, and when the starter engaged, the engine responded smoothly. No hesitation, no irregular vibration. The rotor blades gathered speed again, not as a dramatic reveal this time, but as confirmation. The aircraft lifted a few feet off the ground in a controlled hover, steady and balanced against the fading orange sky. Whitaker watched the maneuver with calm satisfaction. After a short hover check, Mercer brought the Apache back down gently, landing with controlled confidence. The engine powered down gradually, and silence returned in stages rather than all at once. Mercer stepped out of the cockpit and walked directly to Ethan. "I appreciate the lesson," he said plainly. "I will not forget it." Ethan studied him for a moment, reading sincerity rather than rank. "Good," he answered. "Because the next time, you may not have someone standing nearby to point at the detail." Brooks felt the weight of that truth settle into his chest. Experience was not always present to rescue oversight. It had to be cultivated. Whitaker approached, boots firm on the concrete. "Captain," he said, "you learned something valuable today." Mercer nodded. "Yes, sir. That knowledge is not always found in the newest system." Whitaker's gaze shifted briefly to Ethan. "And that respect is not automatic. It is earned, and sometimes rediscovered." The breeze cooled further as twilight deepened, and base lights flickered on along the perimeter. Ethan glanced once more at the Apache, then toward the horizon beyond the runway. He had not come for recognition. He had come because machines spoke a language he understood. As he turned to leave, Brooks stepped forward instinctively. "Sir," he said, "would you come back sometime? Maybe talk to the crew?" Ethan paused, considering. A faint smile crossed his face. "If there is coffee," he said lightly. Mercer allowed himself a small grin. "We can arrange that." Whitaker watched Ethan walk toward the parking area, posture steady despite the years, and felt a quiet reassurance settle over him. The aircraft behind them rested ready for tomorrow's mission. The captain stood wiser than he had been that morning, and the lesson carried forward, simple and enduring. Some standards are written in manuals. Others are written in memory. The parking lot lights flickered on one by one as Ethan Caldwell reached his old pickup truck, the paint dulled by years of sun, but the engine maintained with the same steady care he gave every machine he respected. He paused before opening the door and glanced back toward the flight line where the Apache now rested under the glow of mounted floodlights, its silhouette sharp against the deepening indigo sky. From a distance it looked calm, composed, ready, the way it should. Behind him, footsteps approached at a measured pace. Captain Ryan Mercer slowed as he reached Ethan's side. No urgency in his stride now, only intention. "Sir," Mercer said quietly, hands clasped behind his back out of habit. "I meant what I said earlier." Ethan turned, studying the younger man's face in the soft light. The bravado from the afternoon was gone, replaced by something steadier. "I know," Ethan replied. "You corrected yourself. That matters." Mercer nodded once. "I have spent years trusting systems. Today reminded me to trust people too." The words were simple, but they carried weight earned over the course of a single afternoon. Colonel James Whitaker stood several yards away, observing without intrusion. He understood that some conversations were better left unstructured, unrecorded, free of rank. Specialist Daniel Brooks lingered near the edge of the lot, not wanting to interrupt, but unwilling to miss a moment that felt quietly significant. A light breeze moved across the asphalt, carrying the distant hum of generators and the faint metallic scent of cooling aircraft. Ethan rested one hand on the truck door handle. "Leadership is not about knowing everything," he said calmly. "It is about listening long enough to recognize when someone else does." Mercer absorbed that without defensiveness. "I will remember that." Ethan allowed a faint smile. "Good. Because the next generation will be watching you the way your crew watched today." The statement settled deeply. Brooks straightened unconsciously, realizing he had indeed been watching, learning not just from Ethan, but from Mercer's response to correction. Whitaker finally stepped forward, his presence steady and grounding. "Ethan," he said, voice low, "the base would benefit from your perspective more often." Ethan considered that, eyes drifting briefly toward the hangars lined in quiet rows. "If it helps keep them sharp," he answered, "I can stop by from time to time." Whitaker gave a single nod, satisfied. Mercer extended his hand once more, this time without hesitation or formality. Ethan shook it firmly. There was no audience now, no spectacle, only acknowledgement. As Ethan opened the truck door, Mercer spoke again. "Sir," when the blades started turning, "I realized something." Ethan paused. "What was that?" Mercer met his gaze steadily. "Experience does not age out. It just waits to be respected." Ethan's eyes reflected the parking lot lights for a brief moment. Then he inclined his head. "That is a lesson worth keeping." He climbed into the driver's seat, engine starting with a smooth, familiar rumble. As the truck pulled away, the base lights shimmered in the rearview mirror, and the Apache remained steady under the glow of evening illumination. Back on the flight line, Mercer and Brooks stood beside Colonel Whitaker, watching the taillights fade into the distance. The helicopter would fly again tomorrow. The systems would run diagnostics. The screens would glow green. But something unseen had aligned more precisely than any linkage beneath a panel. Standards had been reaffirmed. Respect had been recalibrated. And long after the last light dimmed over Fort Reading, the quiet lesson of that afternoon remained, steady as steel and just as enduring. The next morning arrived clear and cool over Fort Reading. The horizon washed in pale blue as the first light touched the flight line and painted long silver streaks across the concrete. Captain Ryan Mercer was already there before most of the crew, standing beside the Apache with a clipboard tucked under his arm, not out of obligation, but intent. The aircraft rested in quiet readiness, dew faintly clinging to its canopy, the metal cool before the Texas sun began its climb. Specialist Daniel Brooks approached carrying a maintenance log, noticing immediately that Mercer was not scrolling through a tablet this time. He was listening to the low hum of ground power units, to the subtle creak of cooling composite, to the ordinary sounds that had once blended into background noise. Colonel James Whitaker watched from the edge of the hangar, arms folded, saying nothing. He recognized the posture of someone recalibrating. Mercer ran his hand lightly along the engine housing, feeling the surface temperature, checking alignment with both sight and touch. "Heat shifts tolerance," he said quietly to Brooks, not quoting, but applying. Brooks nodded, absorbing the difference in tone from just 24 hours earlier. The diagnostic screens still glowed green when they powered up, lines steady, systems nominal, but Mercer did not rely on it alone. He crouched briefly to inspect the linkage Ethan Caldwell had adjusted, ensuring it sat true before proceeding. There was no drama this time. No hesitation. The startup sequence engaged smoothly, and the rotor blades began to turn with balanced precision, each rotation even and confident. As the helicopter lifted into a controlled hover, Mercer felt not pride, but clarity. The lesson from the previous afternoon was not about embarrassment. It was about foundation. Experience was not a challenge to authority. It was its reinforcement. The aircraft settled back down after a brief systems check, and Mercer shut it down carefully, allowing the engine to cool at proper intervals. Brooks approached with a faint smile. "Feels different today," he said. Mercer nodded once. "It is," he answered. "Yesterday, I trusted the machine. Today I trust the process." Whitaker stepped forward then, boots firm against the concrete. "And the people," he added. Mercer met his gaze steadily. "And the people," he confirmed. The sun rose higher, warming the tarmac, casting sharp shadows beneath the landing gear. Other crews moved into position along the line, preparing their aircraft with the same measured focus. Word of the previous day had traveled quietly, not as gossip, but as respect. Ethan Caldwell was not present that morning, yet his influence lingered in every deliberate motion. Brooks closed the maintenance log and looked toward the parking area as if half expecting an old pickup truck to roll in again. It did not. It did not need to. Some lessons do not require repetition. They require application. Mercer stood beside the Apache for a long moment after the crew dispersed, watching the early light reflect off the canopy. Steel remembers steady hands. So do leaders. And as the base came fully alive under the rising sun, the rhythm of the blades, the precision of the checks, and the quiet confidence in his stance carried forward a standard that had been reaffirmed, not by rank, but by recognition. By midweek the tempo at Fort Reading had shifted in subtle but measurable ways, the kind that did not show up on readiness reports but revealed themselves in posture and pause. Captain Ryan Mercer stood in the small briefing room just off the hangar floor, a schematic of the Apache projected behind him, the image crisp against the white wall. Specialist Daniel Brooks sat in the front row with several other crew members, notebooks open, not because they were required to take notes, but because they wanted to. Colonel James Whitaker leaned against the back wall, arms folded loosely, observing without interrupting. Mercer did not begin with data. He did not begin with performance metrics or mission timelines. He began with a question. "When you run diagnostics," he said evenly, "what do you assume the machine cannot tell you?" The room remained quiet for a moment, the hum of the air conditioning unit the only sound. Brooks raised his hand slightly. "Thermal shift," he answered. "Mechanical alignment under load." Mercer nodded once. "And experience," he added. He walked toward the projection and tapped the area near the governor linkage. 2 millimeters. That was the difference. He did not mention embarrassment. He did not mention ego. He spoke in terms of responsibility. "We operate some of the most advanced aircraft in the world," he continued, voice steady and controlled. "But no system replaces judgment. No update replaces awareness." Whitaker watched the younger soldiers absorb the message. This was how culture shifted. Not through reprimand, but through example. After the briefing, Mercer led the crew back onto the flight line where the morning sun reflected sharply off the aircraft canopies. The air carried the familiar scent of fuel and heated metal. Brooks noticed that the pre-flight checks moved at a deliberate pace, not slow, not rushed. Measured. Each step acknowledged. Each sound considered. When the Apache powered up again later that morning, the rotor blades spun smoothly, cutting through the bright air with confident precision. There was no applause. There was no ceremony. Just quiet competence reinforced. Whitaker approached Mercer after the sortie and placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Leadership is not about never being wrong," he said quietly. "It is about correcting course without hesitation." Mercer met his gaze with calm assurance. "Understood, sir." The exchange was brief, but it carried weight. Across the tarmac, Brooks watched the helicopter taxi into position for another flight, the machine steady, balanced, responsive. He thought of the old pickup truck that had disappeared down the access road 2 evenings earlier. Ethan Caldwell was not on base that day, yet his presence lingered in the way tools were handled, in the way questions were asked, in the way silence was respected. The lesson had moved beyond a single moment. It had embedded itself into routine. As the aircraft lifted once more into the clear Texas sky, Mercer stood grounded, eyes following its ascent not with pride, but with perspective. Systems would evolve. Software would advance. Ranks would change. But the standard remained constant. Listen, align, respect. And when the blades begin to turn, let them carry forward not just power, but the memory of the hands that taught you how to start. The following week unfolded with the steady rhythm of disciplined routine. Yet beneath the surface of daily operations something had matured across Fort Redding's flight line. Captain Ryan Mercer no longer approached the Apache with the subtle tension of proving himself. Instead, he carried the quiet focus of someone aware that mastery is layered, not declared. Specialist Daniel Brooks noticed it first during an early morning inspection when Mercer paused before signing off on a systems check and asked, "What does it sound like to you?" The question was not rhetorical. It was deliberate. Brooks closed his eyes briefly, listening past the hum of generators and the distant rumble of transport aircraft. "Balanced," he said. "No fluctuation." Mercer nodded, satisfied not with agreement, but with awareness. Colonel James Whitaker observed these exchanges from a measured distance, recognizing that the transformation he had hoped for was no longer theoretical. It was visible in posture, tone, and tempo. Later that afternoon, a minor inconsistency appeared in a fuel pressure reading during a routine run-up. It was subtle, well within acceptable range, the kind of fluctuation that software would categorize as negligible. A week earlier Mercer might have cleared it without hesitation. Instead, he held up a hand. "Run it again," he instructed calmly. The crew complied. The reading stabilized, confirming there was no mechanical fault. Mercer still stepped closer to the engine housing, resting his palm briefly against the metal as if listening through touch. Brooks exchanged a brief glance with another technician. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, yet it carried the imprint of a lesson learned. Whitaker approached afterward, boots steady on the sun-warmed concrete. "You did not ignore it," he said. Mercer shook his head once. "I wanted to be certain." Whitaker allowed a faint nod. Certainty built on awareness is strength. Certainty built on assumption is risk. The afternoon light cast long shadows beneath the aircraft as another successful systems check concluded. Word had spread beyond the immediate crew. Other teams on base began incorporating similar pauses, similar questions, similar respect for the details that did not always announce themselves. Ethan Caldwell had not returned yet, but his influence had become part of the culture, woven quietly into the rhythm of operations. Brooks found himself mentoring a newer technician that evening, repeating a phrase he had heard only days earlier. "Machines reward patience," he said, tightening a panel latch with care. Mercer overheard and gave the slightest approving nod. As dusk approached and the final aircraft settled back onto the runway, the rotor blades slowed into stillness against a fading orange sky. Mercer stood with Whitaker at the edge of the flight line, watching the controlled descent. "It was not about the helicopter," Mercer said quietly. Whitaker studied him. "No," he agreed. "It was about alignment." The word carried weight beyond mechanics. Alignment of judgment. Alignment of respect. Alignment of leadership. The base lights flickered on one by one as the evening settled. Somewhere beyond the perimeter road, an old pickup truck moved along a quiet stretch of highway, unaware that its owner's lesson had reshaped more than a single afternoon. And as Fort Redding prepared for another day of disciplined precision, one truth remained steady as steel. The strongest systems are not only engineered, they are remembered. 2 weeks later, the change at Fort Redding was no longer subtle. It was structured. Captain Ryan Mercer stood at the front of the hangar bay beside a whiteboard filled not with flight schedules, but with handwritten notes titled Operational Awareness. The Apache rested behind him under bright overhead lights, its dark frame reflecting the steady glow as if listening to the conversation unfolding in front of it. Specialist Daniel Brooks sat among a half-circle of crew members, some from other units who had requested to attend the informal session. Colonel James Whitaker stood off to the side, not in command posture, but as a witness to growth. Mercer did not speak loudly. He did not need to. Technology evolves, he began evenly. but judgment must evolve with it. He gestured toward the aircraft. We are trained to interpret data. That is necessary. But we are also responsible for interpreting context. He paused, allowing the weight of the words to settle. Heat changes alignment. Time changes response. Experience changes perspective. Brooks recognized the pattern immediately. The language was not memorized. It was internalized. A younger lieutenant raised a hand. Sir, how do you know when to trust instinct over the system? Mercer considered the question carefully before answering. You do not replace one with the other, he said. You align them. If something feels inconsistent, you investigate. You do not dismiss. Whitaker allowed himself a faint nod. Alignment. The same word from days earlier, now part of doctrine without being labeled as such. After the discussion concluded, the crew dispersed toward the aircraft for a routine systems evaluation. Mercer walked beside Brooks, hands relaxed at his sides. You have been sharper lately, Mercer observed. Brooks gave a modest shrug. I am listening more. Mercer smiled slightly. Good. Pass that forward. The afternoon sun filtered through the open hangar doors, casting long lines of light across the polished floor. Outside, another helicopter completed a smooth landing, rotors slowing with controlled precision. The sound was familiar, steady, disciplined. Whitaker stepped closer to Mercer once the crew moved into position. You are shaping something larger than a single unit, he said quietly. Mercer glanced toward the Apache, then back at the colonel. I learned from someone who did not ask for credit, he replied. Whitaker studied him for a moment. That is usually how the strongest foundations are built. Across the flight line, Brooks guided a newer technician through a detailed inspection, repeating a phrase he had adopted as habit. Listen before you adjust. The younger soldier nodded earnestly, absorbing not just instruction, but tone. The culture had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. As evening approached and the sky turned a deep shade of amber over Texas, Mercer stood alone for a moment beside the Apache, palm resting lightly against its surface. The metal was warm from the day's operations, steady beneath his touch. He did not see only hardware anymore. He saw continuity. Experience passed forward. Standards reinforced quietly. Leadership recalibrated. The rotor blades above him were still, yet the lesson they represented continued to move. And long after the lights in the hangar dimmed and the base settled into nighttime routine, one truth remained embedded in the rhythm of Fort Reading. The most reliable systems are not only engineered with precision, they are guided by memory. Autumn settled gradually over Fort Reading, the sharp heat of late summer easing into crisp mornings where breath faintly touched the air and the flight line carried a quieter, steadier rhythm. Months had passed since the afternoon when a small misalignment had reshaped more than an engine. Captain Ryan Mercer now moved with a confidence that no longer needed display. It showed in the way he paused before signing off on a checklist, in the way he listened before issuing direction, in the way he allowed younger crew members space to think before correcting them. Specialist Daniel Brooks had grown as well, his hands sure when securing panels, his questions sharper, his tone measured. Colonel James Whitaker observed from a distance with the calm assurance of a leader who understood that culture does not change in a day, but it can pivot in one decisive moment. On a clear morning under a pale blue Texas sky, the Apache stood ready for a training sortie. Frost clung lightly to the edges of the tarmac, melting as sunlight spread across the base. Mercer conducted the pre-flight inspection with Brooks at his side. They checked the linkage that had once been 2 millimeters off, not because they expected failure, but because attention had become habit. The aircraft powered up smoothly, rotor blades gathering speed in a steady, confident rhythm. As it lifted into the air and hovered against the rising sun, Mercer felt no surge of ego, only alignment. The machine responded not just to commands, but to care. After landing, Mercer remained beside the aircraft for a moment longer than required. Brooks approached with a quiet grin. Everything's steady, he reported. Mercer nodded. Keep it that way. Whitaker joined them, boots crisp against the concrete. You have built something solid here, he said. Mercer shook his head slightly. It was already there, he replied. I just learned to see it. In the distance, beyond the perimeter fence, an old pickup truck moved along a 2-lane highway lined with open fields. Ethan Caldwell drove with the radio low. Unaware of how deeply his presence had embedded itself into the base he had quietly influenced. He did not seek acknowledgement. He did not need ceremony. The lesson had traveled without him. Back on the flight line, Brooks guided a new recruit through an inspection, repeating calmly, "Listen before you adjust." The words no longer felt borrowed. They felt owned. The Apache rested under the broad Texas sky, metal steady, systems ready. Mercer watched the younger soldier mimic Brooks's careful movements and allowed himself a faint smile. Standards had been recalibrated. Respect had been recognized. Leadership had been refined without spectacle. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the runway, and the final aircraft of the day descended smoothly toward the base, one truth remained grounded in the culture of Fort Reading. Some legends do not raise their voices. They raise the standard.